are the other questions. We were talking about the Abyssinian War, or the Mussolini's attack against his independent country Ethiopia, which was the only African independent country left. All the others were more or less either colonies or protectorates under one of the European countries' control or influence. We had seen that why Mussolini did this, and we had also seen what the reaction was. The reaction was that that public opinion was outraged. Italy was condemned at the League of Nations, and Mussolini was upset and was furious against those who had been sitting with him at the Stresa front and who now condemned him for this aggression. Because, and this is something which I had not mentioned when we spoke about the Stresa meeting. Remember, the Stresa meeting had taken place when Hitler had proclaimed that he was introducing the compulsory military service, and that he had determined that Germany would have something like 35 divisions, 500,000 soldiers, whereas it was, following the Versailles Treaty, only allowed to have 100,000. When they had met and they had agreed to guarantee the frontiers as they had been established in Europe after World War I, and that they also had specifically guaranteed the territorial integrity of Austria. Now, at the end of the meeting of Stresa, which we go back till April, at the end of the meeting, Mussolini asked casually his two, let's say, partners, do you have anything else to discuss? And when the French and the British said no, Mussolini considered that this was practically the green light, a free hand for preparing his attack against Ethiopia. Because everybody knew that Italian supplies were passing through the Suez Canal. The British knew perfectly well that these were not ordinary supplies. These were preparations, because this ammunition, these armaments went either to Somalia or to Eritrea in view of the attack against Ethiopia. So when Mussolini asked them, do you have anything to discuss? And they said no, he interpreted this no, that the French and the British, knowing what he was preparing, did agree with his attack. And when this was now not the case, when the British government also, they were embarrassed, the French also, under the pressure of their public opinion, had to condemn, at least orally, before the League of Nations, the Italian aggression, Mussolini was absolutely furious, and he turned his back on the French and the British. He felt that they were no use for him. But that was not all. What did also take place was that the public opinion in the different European countries, they were upset about the cynicism, about the cynical behavior of the French and the British. Because the French and the British, at the tribune of the League of Nations, condemned Italy, but when it came down to take practical measures in retaliation against the Italian invasion, they did declare the boycott of a number of goods, particularly of food, of secondary materials, which did hurt the Italian the Italian population, because they could not get a number of supplies they usually had in their commercial transactions with the British and the French. But what the British did not do, the French neither, was to cut simply the supply line of the Italian army, which went from Italy through the Suez Canal to these two Italian colonies, Somalia and Eritrea. In other words, if the French and the British had really wanted to stop the Italians, The British would have said, now that's it now. No Italian supply will pass through the Suez Canal. That would have been it, but they didn't do it. So in other words, they allowed the military supply to get through, and they only, in order to comply for the surface, for the facade, to the expectation of their public opinion, they organized such a boycott which only hurt slightly the Italian population, but which did not in any way hamper the war effort of Mussolini's government against Ethiopia. So in other words, this was a proof of double talk, and it was not exactly, let's say, to boost the morale of public opinion, seeing this kind of I should say, cynical behavior. In other words, by the end of 1935, Hitler, because we analyze those events from Hitler's vantage point, Hitler had every reason to be satisfied. On the one hand, he could now openly rearm, because he had, on 3 different levels, he had violated the limitations of the Versailles Peace Treaty, and he got by. So he could continue his war effort on a massive scale. Secondly, the attempt to set up a coalition, an alliance against him, which the Stresa Front was, had failed. The Italian aggression against Ethiopia was such that Italy turned its back on the French and the British, but the Italians could not remain isolated. They needed an ally, because they needed support, not only political but also economic and military. So Mussolini now turned around and turned towards Hitler. In other words, a little bit more than 2 years after he had come to power, he had the Italians now on the way to move closer to him. So in that regard, the year 1935 was a successful year for Hitler. We get to the year 1936 now. The year 1936 was a very eventful year, more even so than the year 1935, and certainly more than the year 1937, which will follow. I will single out for you so that you can have a clear view. There were 4 events. 2 were of the utmost importance and 2 were of secondary importance. Let me pick out first the key events. The first event did take place in March 1936, and it was the entry of the German army into the demilitarized Rhinelands. Now, I explained this to you. This entry of the German army into the demilitarized Rhineland, this was another stipulation of the Versailles Peace Treaty. This other stipulation, which was practically added to the Versailles Peace Treaty, came on French request. The French and also the other Western neighbors of Germany requested that the German army could not come closer than 50 kilometers to the Rhine River, east. In other words, they had to stay away at least 50 kilometers from the Rhine, in order not to be right on the frontiers of their Western neighbors. And this Rhine Valley, with the 50 kilometers east, these are the Rhinelands. And the reason why this was demilitarized, that is, the German army was not allowed, was to prevent a surprise attack of this German army against the Western neighbors. That is, against the French and against Luxembourg, against Belgium, against Holland. Now, this being said, that is the first event. The entry, the violation of the Rhinelands by the German army. The second event, equally important, or at least as important, was the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War broke out mid-July, I think it was the 17th of mid-July 1936, and it will last nearly for 3 years. This Spanish Civil War was also of the utmost political importance. the two other events, which were of relatively minor importance, were number one, the Olympic Games in July, August in Berlin. The Olympic Games were held in 1936 in Berlin. And the last event, the fourth event, also of minor importance, but it still played a role, was the anti-Comintern Pact. Anti-Comintern, Comintern, I have already mentioned it the first time, you spell it capital K-O-M-I-N-T-E-R-N. The Comintern is the name for the Communist International. It is an association of the communist parties worldwide. And an anti-Comintern pact is a pact which was signed in September 1936 by Germany and Japan. And it was directed not against a country, but against an institution. And this institution was the Comintern. So in other words, I repeat the four events: the violation of the Rhinelands by the German army, or the entry of the German army into the Rhinelands, the Spanish Civil War, the Olympic Games, and the anti-Comintern Pact. We begin now with the first event in chronological order, and that's the entry of the German army into the Rhinelands. Now, here I would like to open a parenthesis. You just listen. I want you to proceed also for other events, which we will be examining, analyzing from now on. But you can even extend it to others which we might have already seen before. You should proceed, I would say, through a triple approach. First, origins. Which were the origins of the event? Why did this happen? Or why precisely did Hitler do this? The second things are the events themselves. How did the events unfold? What did Hitler do? What were the others do? What did the others do in reaction to what Hitler was doing? And the third thing will be the consequences. In other words, ask yourself, and look also on your notes, origins, events, consequences. We begin with the first part of origins. Why? Why did Hitler order the German army in March 1936 to move into the Rhinelands? Now, first, Hitler was gambling, because this was without any doubt a very important issue. And it was a very important issue for the French, because the French were those who were separated. The French were a great power, and they were separated from the German army, which Hitler was rearming now, was making ready for war. They were separated by a distance of at least 50 kilometers. In some instances, when the Rhine was flowing through, it was practically the border all the time. So they had time, if ever Hitler would plan an attack, to be pre-warned. So the French had to be the most sensitive to this. Why did Hitler now act? Hitler tried to test the willingness of the Western democracies to square accounts with him. And at the same time, he wanted to isolate Eastern Europe from a French intervention. In other words, to have a free hand later on in Eastern Europe. And that is why he considered that the German army should enter a territory which was, and I would like to leave no doubt on it, this was German territory. It was not a territory belonging to France. It was a territory which was a German territory, but the Germans were not allowed to have the army. So in that sense, he did not violate the territorial sovereignty of another country. It was his own land. And it still represented, you could say, a limitation of his own sovereignty over a part of his own country. Just imagine if the United States would have been forced not to have the American army in Alaska, for instance. This would be not a normal situation, because after all, a country has the right to dispose over all its territory, politically, economically, and also militarily. Now, when Hitler, still the origin, when Hitler talked to his advisors, military and political, what he meant to do, they strongly advised him not to do it. Because the military and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Foreign Affairs was a nationalist, a body from Papen's days, von Neurath. You find the name in Bullock easily, but the name is not that important. They said no, because they were afraid that the French would militarily react to this. And that if the French militarily reacted, the French army was much stronger than the German army. So Hitler would have been forced to withdraw, to accept a military defeat, because he could not resist. The French were much too powerful. And so he would lose face. And he certainly would not, the German army would not stop fighting with the French. And so his advisors considered that the normal French reaction would be a military reaction, and that they would have to pull out, and this would be a blunder. But Hitler gambled that the French would not react, that he would get by. So he did this, and in his traditional approach, this violation, he gave this order on a Friday afternoon, because the French government was dismissed. The British, it was about the same. So a weekend would lie ahead where the French would be forced to act. Now, the fact is that the French government did get together right away and first protested violently, and the French politicians said that they would not accept it. The question was, what would they do? So they turned then, the French government turned to its own generals, to the French army, and to ask the generals if they could react militarily and hit back the Germans. And the man who was at the head of the French army at that time was General Gamelin. You spell it Gamelin, Gamelin, General Gamelin. So Gamelin said, of course, if you as government, if you order us to react, we will. But, and now came the but immediately, but he said, there is of course a problem, because we do not have offensive war plans. The French had, in the late 20s, early 30s, they had built up a defense line along the German border, from the Swiss border to the Belgian border. And this defense line was named after a French minister of war, Maginot. You spell it capital M-A-G-I-N-O-T, the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line is a sequence of fortifications from the Swiss border to Belgium, which was the heavily armed fortress system linked with one another, which the French imagined that the Germans would attack and that they would practically apply in case of such a German attack, the same kind of strategy which they had successfully applied in World War I during the Battle of Verdun. Verdun, V-E-R-D-U-N. Verdun is a place which is at about an hour and 15 minutes away from Luxembourg, which had a French fortress which gave an opportunity to the German army to test the French resistance when the biggest battle fought between France and Germany in World War I was the Battle of Verdun. And the Germans lost. They were unable to break through. So the French, as this was a victorious battle, the French then thought that they would build a whole fortification system against Germany, and that if the Germans would attack, that they would then apply the same strategy as they did in the days of World War I. But you know, in history, the next war is never fought the same way as the preceding war. Because there is an evolution in strategy, there is an evolution in armaments. At the time of Verdun, the Air Force did not play a role. There were no tanks. So in other words, the situation will be totally different. And the French tried to, as a kind of response against the Germans, to organize a potential gigantic Verdun battlefield by building this Maginot Line. But the point is now, because they organized their strategy on this issue of a defensive strategy against a German attack, they did not have themselves an offensive war plan. There were no such plans. In other words, if they now were to respond, to react against the German occupation of the Rhinelands, they had rapidly to draw an offensive scheme. So Gamelin said, we don't have any kind of offensive war plans, so he said it would be good if the British would join us. If the British army would also participate in such a venture to kick the Germans out of the Rhinelands. So in other words, Gamelin's answer was not a frank, yes, we react now. It was, yes, we can do it, but preferably the British should join us because we have no offensive strategy. And so the French politicians turned to the British. And the British, they gave us an answer over the weekend that they fully understood the French concern, and they would fully support the French response if there were a military response, that they would politically and morally support the French. But they refused militarily to participate in such a reaction. So they said, if you react, we are not going to blame you. We will support you because this is a violation. And it was not only a violation of the Versailles Treaty, it was even also a violation of the Locarno Treaty, which the Germans had signed with the French and the British in 1925. So, but the British said, look, we are not ready to participate. We are all geared, all concentrate on economic revival, on our economic problems. And that is, and after all, the British said, why should we participate? Because when we see what was happening, what are the Germans doing? But they are occupying their own land, their own territory. We understand that you feel threatened because the German army will move practically to the French border, and that the Cathedral of Strasbourg will come under the potential fire of German guns. But we are far away. So in other words, the British were not threatened themselves by this German move. So in other words, when the British gave this half answer, we support you morally and politically, the French government then did not make up its mind to give the orders to the army to answer the German violation. So the French gave up their ideas of reacting militarily. They protested violently. Political protest. That was it. And of course, this will have far-reaching consequences, because Hitler, once the French did not react, he gave then the order, right after the occupation of the Rhineland, to build parallel to the Maginot Line his own defense line, which was by far not as impressive, but which had essentially a psychological character. And this German fortification line was called the Siegfried Line. The Siegfried Line is Siegfried. Hitler always liked to deter names out of the Germanic legendary past. You know, Siegfried is the name of a hero of earlier Germanic days. Those of you who know Richard Wagner, he wrote a trilogy on the Nibelungen, and Siegfried is one of the great heroes of this, but I do not want to expand on the name. So he built the Siegfried Line. Capital S-I-E-G-F-R-I-E-D, Siegfried. So these were the events, the occupation, the consequences now. The consequences were of the utmost importance. First of all, Hitler had done this against the advice of his generals and of his Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he got by. So from now on, he will not only not listen to them any longer, but he will even discard any advice. They were not supposed to dare to advise him to the contrary of what he intended to do. Because from now on he believed, not only was the word passed out that the Führer is always right, he himself believed that he was always right, which was, of course, a relatively dangerous purpose. That is the first thing. Secondly, when he constructed the Siegfried Line, this meant for one French ally, and there were several French allies in Eastern Europe, Poland, for instance, Czechoslovakia, Romania. These were countries with whom France had military treaties, which stipulated that in case of an attack, it was bilateral. The other country would come to the rescue of the one which was attacked. In other words, if Poland or Czechoslovakia or Romania were attacked, the French were supposed to react militarily, politically and militarily. But now that they had not reacted at the moment when there was no Siegfried Line, now that the Siegfried Line was there, this meant that the French practically, because they did not know how strong the Siegfried Line ultimately would be, the French were cut off from a possible military intervention in the interest of their Eastern European allies. So in other words, the French Eastern European alliances became this way worthless for their Eastern European allies, Poland, Czechoslovakia and Romania. There is one more consequence. This other consequence had to do with Belgium. Belgium was a French ally from the days of World War I on. The Belgians, after all, had gone to war when Germany had attacked in 1914 on the French side. And when the war was over, a military and political alliance existed between France and Belgium. And the French Maginot Line was extended from the Belgian border on northwards. So in other words, Belgium was not only a neighbor, but a close ally of France. When the Belgians now noticed how weak the French reaction were, that is, that the French would not take military action against these Germans moving closer to their borders, they became upset, and they thought it over, what this alliance with France might ultimately bring them in case of a war with Germany. As the French had the Maginot Line, the danger was that the Germans might try to pass north of the Maginot Line. And then the battles which would be fought, where would those battles be fought then? On Belgian territory. So in other words, the Belgians were concerned by that the French, by reacting so weakly and meekly, would ultimately bring about a situation that in case of a German attack, that the battleground would be Belgium. And they wanted to avoid this. And so they reacted by ending their alliance with France. They declared their alliance with France, military and political, as over. So in other words, the French lost an ally, Belgium, and the Belgians resumed their earlier attitude of pre-1914 days. It was, by the way, the same attitude as the one which the Dutch had and which Luxembourg had. That was an attitude of neutrality, to stay out of any kind of future conflict by declaring their neutrality. Of course, the neutrality of a country was only worth as much as those who went to war would be willing to respect this neutrality. But it was a setback for the French, of course. The Belgians, dropping out of their alliance. It was a serious setback, and Hitler had it easier. But there were two more consequences, and these two more consequences were of a moral and of a psychological and a political nature. Hitler had tested the determination of the Western democracies to go to war with him or to take strong action with him already in 1935, when he declared to resume full rearmament. This was a much graver challenge. This was a much graver provocation for the French, because the French were directly threatened, and also the other neighbors. And Hitler considered, as he did get away with it, without a strong French reaction. In other words, he considered from now on that the Western democracies were weak, decadent, and cowards, that he could continue in his violations of other treaties, and that he would get by. So in other words, the lessons he was drawing from this was a lesson that he could continue to break treaties one after the other, that the Western democracies, particularly the French, that they were decadent, and that he would get away with it. And there is one more thing which is very important. This one more thing is that by not reacting, by not taking the responsibility to act as a great power, the French were stepping down from their position as a great power, which would react independently from what others were doing. Because the French, after all, in 1923, in January, remember, when the Germans had been late in the deliveries of telephone poles, the French had entered the Ruhr area, the French army. Now, telephone poles, late deliveries, that was nothing compared to this provocation. So in other words, the French did not only cease to be a great power when the Germans ultimately attacked on May 1940 and defeated the French army in less than 5 weeks, they ceased to be already a great power when they refused to take strong action in March 1936, when Hitler entered the Rhinelands. That was the end of France as a genuine great European power. The awareness that this had happened came when they were defeated by the Germans 4 years later. So in this sense, the Rhineland occupation by Hitler, by the German army, was of the utmost importance for the future. Yes?
Who were their allies?
The French allies. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania. Yes?
So wait, was Great Britain not a French ally?
Who?
Great Britain.
There was no formal alliance.
Okay.
With the others, there were formal alliances.
Okay.
The British were on the French side from the days on, but the British were not now formally allies with the French. The French trusted them that they would help against the Germans because they had a common interest to keep the Germans down. Okay. Now we get to our next point, and this is the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War, which started in July 19... I'll just say what this Civil War was like, and then we will apply our method of working in 3 steps: origins, events, consequences. The Spanish Civil War was a civil war which broke out when the Spanish army rebelled against the Spanish government in July, I think it was 17th, I'm not sure, but it was mid-July 1936, and the rebellion did take place first not even in Spain itself, but in Spanish Morocco. But then the Spanish garrisons, the army garrison in Spain also rebelled against the Republican government. And this army rebellion turned into a civil war, which split Spain in two camps, and which also entailed a foreign intervention. Other powers did intervene in this Spanish Civil War, and it lasted until May 1939. In other words, it lasted for nearly 3 years. It devastated. In other words, there was an international intervention into this war. It devastated Spain, and it cost the lives of 1 million people. You could say that in terms of violence, in terms of war actions, it was like a prelude of World War II. Because you could not say that this was a secondary state. No, when 1 million people die, that is a very clear sign of the violence of what did take place and of the savagery with which this war was fought. Now, we are interested and ultimately it ended with the victory of the military, and particularly of the commanding general of the military rebels. This commanding general was General Franco. And at the end of the war, Franco established a dictatorship in Spain. And this Franco dictatorship will last from 1939 on until 1975, when it ultimately ended. And Spain became again a monarchy and a democracy. Now this just to show you what this was about. Now let's have a closer term on the origins. Which were the origins of this war? First of all, there were long-range origins. That is, there were causes which go back into Spanish history, and I do not want now to give you a survey of Spanish history back to the days of Napoleon. But Spain, because of Napoleon, and because Napoleon had invaded Spain and had put on the Spanish throne his own brother, Joseph, the Spanish fought back in a resistance, and ultimately the British did intervene. But from the days of Napoleon and of this French intervention, Spain was divided from those days on in 2 hostile camps. On the one side, the Spanish conservative and nationalists, but essentially conservatives who hated this French intervention. On the other side, the Spanish liberals. Now, they were a minority, but nonetheless, the Spanish liberals admired the French Constitution. That is, the French Revolution, which had established a constitution which had abolished the absolutist monarchy in France. The Spanish had an absolutist monarchy like the French. Now, sparing you any kinds of details, but from 1815 on, until practically beyond World War I, until the 30s, Spain was divided into hostile camps, like France. France was also divided from the days of the French Revolution on. It were first the conservatives against the liberals, then afterwards the socialists joined with the liberals and even the communists. So in other words, the legacy of these revolutions and of these violent confrontations of parts of the population, the legacy was that the country was split in two. Now, that is for the long-range hostility of the two camps. But closer to us, Spain had been a monarchy. I already mentioned that to you. But nonetheless, in 1931, that is closer to the time period before the outbreak of the Civil War, the Spanish king, who was the grandfather of the present king, stepped down. He resigned and went into exile, and Spain became a republic. Nonetheless, this did not bring peace to the country. The country had not only a history of confrontation of one camp against the other, it had also a history of military coups, of the army intervening militarily. Now, in addition to all this, from 1931 on until 1936, that is, in the 5 years which preceded the outbreak of the war, when the military rebelled, Spain was the stage first of a setting up of a popular front against the danger of fascism, because there was a fascist party in Spain. This fascist party represented one part of the Spanish right, not all. Not all conservatives were fascists, but nonetheless there existed such a fascist party. The Spanish name is Falange. Remember Stalin, after Hitler had signed the non-aggression pact with Poland, Stalin passed out the order to the communists, to the Communist International, to set up a common front with socialists and with liberals against a potential fascist danger. And this was realized in practical terms in two countries. Such popular fronts came into existence, one in Spain, another one in France. So in other words, in two countries we have this left popular front, which comprised the communists, the liberals, and the socialists. In the two countries, in the spring of 1936, there were elections. And in France, as well as in Spain, the popular fronts did win the elections. So in other words, now popular front governments did take over. And there was, in this popular front, the socialists were the dominating element. So Spain got a socialist prime minister and France got a socialist prime minister. I only mentioned the socialist prime minister in France because he will play a role later on. That was Léon Blum, B-L-U-M. Now, who of you had gone along with Professor Bacchus on his tour? Where did we meet the name of Léon Blum on this tour? Close to Weimar. Yes. Léon Blum had been, when the French lost against the Germans in 1940, he was arrested by the Germans and brought into the concentration camp of Buchenwald. You're right. And this was mentioned on one of the plaques. Yeah. Okay. Now, so in other words, victories of the Popular Front in Spain and in France. The Popular Front in France managed to keep an orderly situation in the country, even though the French fascists, they hated Léon Blum so much. I had already mentioned an uttering of a French fascist who had said, "Better Hitler than Blum." So that gives you an idea of the hatred between the two parties. In Spain, there was an additional problem. In Spain, the Popular Front government did not manage to control the extremist revolutionary parties, which were minority parties, but which were spreading not only unrest and strikes, but also political assassinations and burning of churches and so on. In other words, violence in the country. And these extremist parties were anarchists and also Trotskyist parties. So in other words, in Spain there were left of the communists, of the official communists, there were two fringes parties, anarchist and Trotskyist, and they did not shy away from political assassinations, from burning of churches and so on. So in other words, they spread anarchy and violence. And slowly, because the Popular Front government was not able to master this, a conspiracy was now spreading among the military, as the Spanish military had from the past a tradition of making political coups. Now, this conspiracy among the military was limited to the army, the Spanish Air Force, which was not very important, but still, and the Spanish Navy. Those officers did not participate, but the officers of the army, they did. And there were also sympathies for such a military venture on the part of the Spanish establishment. First, the majority of the Spanish church was conservative and was close to this establishment, hating those, particularly as churches were burnt down and as priests were assassinated. The Spanish monarchists were, of course, also supporting or sympathetic to the generals. Then the big landowners and the big industrial owners, the establishment, they had sympathies for the generals if they would restore order. So in other words, and of course also the Spanish fascists. There was a Spanish fascist party which were of course violently opposed to this Popular Front. So in other words, the Popular Front in Spain had against it a whole line of potential opponents ready to join an action against them. So far for the situation. And now what triggered off the uprising of the generals was the assassination of the Spanish monarchist leader. The Spanish monarchist had a political leader, the name is not important, it was Calvo Sotelo. When he was assassinated, this assassination was considered as the last drop to break the camel's neck. That is, from that moment on, the generals rebelled. So, uprising of the generals. Now, what were the events? The generals had prepared this uprising by making contacts already with Hitler and Mussolini beforehand, before they rebelled. And so it was thanks with the logistic support of the German Air Force that they were able to bring the bulk of the Moroccan troops, because the bulk of the Spanish army was in the so-called Spanish Morocco. These troops were brought over to the mainland Spain through the logistic support of the fascist dictators, and particularly of Hitler. And so, from the beginning on, this civil war did take a European dimension, as European powers would intervene. Now, there is no doubt that had not there been such an outside intervention, that the Republican government, the Popular Front government, would probably have crushed the rebellion. But with now the Spanish generals getting support, this ultimately expanded into real civil war. On the one side, the rebels, And of course, they would not call themselves rebels, they would call themselves nationalists. And they had as their main leader General Franco. There were other generals, but I skipped that. Franco was the top leader of the nationalists. And on the other side, the Republican government, the legitimate official government. The question was now, because of this intervention, how would the other European powers now react to this? So an international conference was held in London to decide. At this conference, all major European powers participated: the British, the French, the Italians, the Germans, and the Russians. And at this London conference, it was decided that the other countries, at least outwardly, would remain neutral, that there would not be foreign intervention, that the other European countries would remain neutral and not intervene. The British were in favor of this, because the British, they had no sympathies for the Popular Front government, as in England there was a conservative government. The French now, the French had practically a sister government in France, a Popular Front government, and Léon Blum was the head. The French, it would have been normal that the French would have supported the legal government, so the Republican government. But Blum ultimately fell behind the British. Léon Blum, the French Popular Front government, said that they would also remain neutral, not intervene. Hitler and Mussolini signed also their pledge to remain neutral, but they did not remain neutral. Hitler massively, and Mussolini also, did massively intervene. Hitler sent to Spain a military corps, an intervention corps, called the Condor Legion, C-O-N-D-O-R. The Condor Legion were 10,000 troops from the three weapons, Army, Air Force, Navy, which came to help Franco. In reality, this Condor Legion was renewed on a regular basis. In other words, Hitler, and we will see that Hitler used now by shift this Condor Legion to train his military on real battleground in Spain. Mussolini sent even over 3 army divisions to help to back up Franco. But that was not all. So in other words, the two fascist dictators, they did intervene. Stalin now. Stalin also officially he had accepted the neutrality, but when he saw that the fascists did intervene, Stalin then sent military supply to the Spanish Republican forces and also political and military advisors. The Stalin's secret service, the NKVD, massively did intervene in Spain. And that was not all. Stalin also, through Comintern, called up the organization of international brigades, that is, of a military volunteer intervention to help the Spanish Republicans. These were the so-called international brigades, which were organized by Comintern, that is, by the communists. Now, these volunteers, they were not all communists, but of course most of them were. And amongst those who did participate were people from all over the world, also Americans. There was, for instance, one American not now directly intervening, but I would say being on the Republican line as a reporter, reporting of what he was watching, of what he was seeing. One of your famous writers.
Hemingway?
Yes. And what came out of Hemingway's presence in Spain? He wrote a novel which was made into a movie with Gary Cooper in the main role. it was the great Gary Cooper, and Ingrid Bergman. What was the movie? What is the novel? For whom? Yes, for whom the bell tolls. That was Hemingway. And also French writers did participate. For instance, Camus at a given moment. And after all, and this is for those who are in my 271 class, there was also a man of Hungarian background who participated among the international brigades. And his name was Arthur Köstler. And as a consequence of his participation, also a novel came out, which he wrote while he was in jail, while he was expected to be executed. Ultimately, he was saved by the British. And this novel was for Darkness at Noon. And other writers did participate on the side of the legitimate Republican government, which got this support from the Communist from Comintern, from the Communist International. But despite of all this, I stay now with the events. The war will continue. Hitler did not now send such massive support to allow Franco to have a rapid, fast victory. The war lasted until May 1939 and ended with the victory of Franco and with the defeat of the Republican government. And with so many, and with the exodus of the defeated Republicans, they fled by the hundreds and thousands over the Pyrenees into France, into Western Europe and into the Soviet Union, where they will be arrested. There was one incident, and I mentioned that already somewhere, particularly famous in 1937. During the Civil War, the Condor Legion, the Air Force element of the Condor Legion, did bomb a northern Spanish Basque civilian town, which caused, on a market day, which caused the death of more than 1,000 people. What's the name of this bombing?
Guernica?
Yes, Guernica. Guernica, and Picasso made a famous painting out of this bombing of these civilians during the Spanish Civil War. So in other words, this was a war which did affect Spain, and I told you Spain entered the days of a dictatorship now. All kinds of atrocities were also committed on both sides of those who were fighting, and particularly with the victory of the rebels, of the nationalists. Those of the enemies who could not get away, they were usually executed or they were arrested. And even now, you might know that there is one Spanish judge, because when Spain became, this is now parenthesis, when Spain became a democracy in 1975, they did not want to reopen the wounds and the scars of the Civil War, so they would pass it over. And only lately, in the last 5 years, a judge has stood out and has started bringing to court the survivors who, and they must be now like the old SS, like the concentration extermination camp fellows who are now in their 80s and in their 90s, but those who committed atrocities are now brought to justice, even now in Spain. Now, this being said, which were the consequences? Because that's what we are interested in. Which were the consequences of the Spanish Civil War, particularly in regards to what Hitler was doing? First of all, it allowed Hitler to divert the attention of what he was planning to do and of what he was doing in Eastern Europe, from Eastern Europe to Spain, because the attention of public opinion was directed on this civil war. And so it had a diversionary effect, and of course it was a cover for him. That is one thing. Secondly, it allowed Hitler to test, for the duration of the Civil War, to test his new weapons, to train his generals and his soldiers, because as I said, the Condor Legion, they were officially 10,000 men, but they were renewed, there were shifts. They served for several months and then new people came in and did the same. So in other words, Hitler could train for his future attacks and his strategies and his weapons. And there was particularly one airplane which the Germans tested, which had a rather, not only a military but also a psychological effect. This was a so-called Stuka bomber. This was a bomber which had one bomb, which had a weight of half a ton. There was a big bomb, and this bomber, that was a dive bomber. Usually they would fly on a certain height and then dive down on the target. And the noise you might have heard in documentary movies, the noise they made when they started their diving down movement was so frightening. The victim knew what would be coming. And just before, practically crashing, they started, the pilots took up the plane again and launched the bomb. And these were the so-called Stuka bombers, which the Germans used in World War II, on the Western Front in Poland and elsewhere. Those of you who have seen the movie the Pianist, you might remember the names of the bombing of Warsaw, where they used also Stukas, who used this kind of bomb. Now, so in other words, Hitler could test this. But that was not all. The Spanish Civil War had also implications in terms of the morale, that is, of the morale of the democracies and of public opinion, because it looked as, on the one side, massive intervention on the part of the fascists Hitler and Mussolini, and on the other side, the massive intervention of Stalin, and no intervention on the part of the democracies, of the British and the French. So it looked as if in the future of Europe there was no place for democracy. It looked as if, on the long run, what happened in Germany, there would only be one alternative: either fascist totalitarianism or communist totalitarianism. In other words, it was a bipolarization, left or right, Stalin or Hitler. And if there was no middle ground for democracy, because in Spain, as the war lasted, the weight of the Communist Party in this coalition was growing. And if the first prime minister was a socialist, the last prime minister of the Popular Front government was a communist. So in that sense, it seemed to symbolize the decadence of the democratic forces in Europe. But that was not all. At the same time, because they both did intervene to help Franco, Hitler and Mussolini on the Spanish battleground became allies and friends and partners. So if Mussolini had turned his back on the Western democracies in late 1935 because they had condemned him over his aggression in Abyssinia, now he became Hitler's close ally, friend and partner. The two dictators now moved very close, and so this alliance was even called an axis Rome-Berlin, a strong link, an axis Rome-Berlin. And this was, of course, a very important victory for Hitler. He had now what he always wanted to have, the Italians being his allies and partners. So in this regard, the Spanish Civil War seemed to be all Hitler could wish he would get. It was a great victory. It was a great profit for Hitler, and it was not only a setback for the Republican forces in Spain, it was a defeat, but it was also a defeat for democracy. As the democratic countries, England and France, left the ground to the fascists. The question, of course, is legitimate. Why did Léon Blum not come to the rescue of the Spanish Popular Front government, which was a sister government? There were two reasons why the French socialists and when Léon Blum did not come, did not intervene. He could have, and he would have switched the outcome of the war. He was afraid of two things. Number one, by doing this, he would have antagonized the British, because the British did not want to intervene. They clearly stated that they would not. And Blum felt that he absolutely needed the support of England against the potential danger which Hitler represented on the eastern frontier of France. So in other words, in order to keep the support of England and the future potential of the British ally, he did not want to antagonize the British, so he followed the British in this kind of passivity, in this kind of non-interventionism. And the second reason is that Blum was afraid that if he would intervene, that this might trigger off in France itself a civil war, that the French fascists and the number of French generals who had lots of sympathies for Franco and for the Spanish nationalists, that they might start an uprising, and that France would face a civil war on its own ground. So out of fear of this internal danger, because the tension in France between left and right was at least as vivid as the tension had been in Spain. And so for these reasons, Blum did not intervene. And by doing this, allowed the victory of Franco and allowed Mussolini and Hitler to get by with their intervention. Now, so far for the Spanish Civil War, this had far-reaching consequences, but Franco nonetheless. Franco will not forget that Hitler, even though he supported him, that Hitler did not grant him this massive support which would have allowed him to win much earlier. So in other words, that Hitler played his own game. And this had as a consequence that the war lasted 3 years. So when World War II came, and when Hitler wanted Franco to enter the war, to join him in the war against the British, Franco refused. The two met in 1940, but Franco would not follow Hitler. Franco would remain neutral, even though he ultimately sent the Spanish Legion to help the Germans in their war against Russia. But Spain will not intervene on the side of Hitler and Mussolini. Yes?
I was just curious, was Portugal neutral the entire time?
Portugal was neutral, yes. Portugal had always, in the past, I would say, privileged links with England. The Portuguese had privileged links with England from late medieval days on. And Portugal had a dictatorship. It was Salazar who was a dictator, but Salazar remained neutral, even though he did not hide his sympathy, a certain sympathy for Hitler, but he would not support Hitler. So far for Franco, and of course, if Franco had entered the war, this would not have changed the outcome of World War II, but this would have meant that Franco would have been brought down. He would have been tried like Mussolini and Hitler, but he got away. And so he survived until his death in 1975. The caudillo. Caudillo is the Spanish word for duce, Führer. His official title was caudillo, Franco's title. Now, briefly, 2 words about these 2 other events. then we will stop for the year 1936. The Olympic Games. The Olympic Games had been decided that they would be held in Berlin long before Hitler had come to power. But nonetheless, the Olympic Games were held. There was no boycott on the part of the democracies or on the part of other countries not to participate. They were held in Berlin. Hitler, for the duration of the war, ordered, let's say, the anti-Semitic measures and this anti-Semitic propaganda to be stopped, to be halted, so not to give too negative a picture for all the guests who came to Berlin. The Berlin Games were held in full order. The Germans had every reason to be happy, not only because everybody came, but also because they won a maximum of medals. There was only one little something which was not so pleasant for them. And these were Jesse Owens' gold medals. Because how could a man like Jesse Owens win gold medals against these German Aryans, who were the superior race? So this was not exactly. As far as I know, he won 4 medals. And Hitler was, of course, not extremely pleased about it, but he couldn't change it, of course. The Germans, nonetheless, they won a lot. So in other words, this was a prestige boost for the Germans. The others came, they won, so after all, the Nazis were not that bad. The last event was the Anti-Comintern Pact, which was signed in September between Germany and Japan. And this Anti-Comintern Pact had been negotiated not by the official German Minister of Foreign Affairs, Neurath, but by Hitler's party, by his Nazi Foreign Affairs advisor, who will become Minister of Foreign Affairs 2 years later, and who is also mentioned in Fest. Who is this fellow? Who is the one who will be Minister of Foreign Affairs of Hitler in 1938? Who has a chapter in Fest?
Ribbentrop?
Yes. You found him in Fest, or did you find him in your passive memory? Both a little bit. Fest and passive memory. Okay. Let's give you the privilege of the doubt. So, von Ribbentrop had negotiated this. An alliance between Germany and Japan against the Communist International. Now, of course, against the Communist International, the one who was singled out by this was Stalin, Soviet Union. Soviet Union was not mentioned, but everybody knew that the Communist International was only the cover for Stalin's intervention in foreign affairs. So by saying anti-Comintern, it was anti-Soviet. But this meant, nonetheless, and that's my point, this meant that now the 3 aggressive dictatorships, the fascist dictatorship in Italy, with whom Hitler had already the Axis Rome-Berlin, the Nazi dictatorship in Germany. Now, between the Nazi dictatorship in Germany and the military dictatorship in Japan, there seemed to be now a full circle, a full link established between the aggressors, whereas at the same time, and this was a demoralizing effect of the signing of the Anti-Comintern Pact, the same as what was going on in Spain, at the same time the democracies seemed to be hopelessly divided, unable to act, and impotent, not doing anything against the dictators. The United States were still, after Roosevelt's second term, in their policy of splendid isolation. The British still were turned away from any kind of intervention, and so the Japanese, the Italians, and Hitler, they seemed to have a free playground for their aggressive policy in the Mediterranean, in Europe, and in the Far East. So far for the anti-Comintern Pact. So by the end of 1936, Hitler had every reason to be more than pleased, because now the international evolution seemed to go in the direction favoring the dictators, the aggressors, those who officially stated that they needed living space and that they were preparing to conquer living space, backing one another up. So far from 1936, we will get to 1937. Would you please now follow up in Bullock as we proceed? And it would be good if you would concentrate on Himmler and Heydrich for next time, because once we will be through with foreign relations, we'll turn to the final solution, and you should be ready for this.